This week on Diabetes Connections, an episode we want you to share with family and friends who don't have any kind of diabetes. They need to hear this. We're talking about bias and stereotypes about diabetes. This is an ongoing issue, but a new survey and campaign looks to spotlight just how much it impacts health. I'm talking about Abbott's recent Above the Bias initiative with a diabetes clinical psychologist. We'll talk about how they measured the physical stuff, what needs to change, and how we can make things better. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of Diabetes Connections. I'm your host, Stacey Sims. Always so glad to have you here. We aim to educate and inspire about diabetes with a focus on people who use insulin. My son was diagnosed with type 1 more than 18 years ago, just before he turned 2. My husband lives with type 2 diabetes. I don't have any kind of diabetes, but I have a background in broadcasting, local radio and television, and that is how you get the podcast. We are just back from Cleveland. Mom's Night Out Cleveland was this past weekend, so a big thank you to everybody who came out for that. I don't mean to sound like a wuss, but oh my gosh, it was so cold. I mean, I'm from New York, but I've lived in Charlotte, North Carolina for more than 25 years now, and I'm a big baby. And when I saw the forecast wasn't going to get above 20, I was not happy. But it was great. It was a great time. Our next Mom's Night Out events are this fall. We will be in Minneapolis in September, and we will be in Phoenix in October, a little bit warmer, I hope. Please. If not, something has gone terribly wrong. And registration will be opening for both of those very soon, so please stay tuned. Quick other calendar notes. Our second ever Bitch Session webinar is tonight. If you're listening as this goes live, February 25th. We're having a webinar this evening at 8 p.m. Eastern. We did this last year, and it's a chance to clear the air. Being a caregiver has its own set of challenges. It's very different than having diabetes, and we want to be sure that moms have a chance to get together and complain because we don't do that enough. I'm a big proponent of clearing the air and complaining, and I think and this happened last time. People were very reluctant to say anything negative, and that's not what the evening becomes about. It becomes about sharing support, realizing that you're not alone. And hey, dads, if you want to jump in there too, feel free. But this is just for caregivers of kids with type 1. Grandparents are welcome too, but you got to bring a complaint. I moderated along with my friend Anna Sabino, who is a certified diabetes care and education specialist who also lives with type 1. And finally, I'm going to be in New Jersey on March 8th. Super excited to be the keynote speaker at the New Jersey Metro and Rockland County Summit. So if you're anywhere near that area, please come out and say hi. I would love to meet you. All right, this week, let's talk about bias. Now, as I had mentioned, my son was diagnosed back in 2006, more than 18 years ago. And I got to tell you, stigma, bias, prejudice against people with diabetes, these are conversations that I heard pretty much as soon as I dipped a toe into the diabetes community, and that had been going on for much longer than that. So when I heard that Abbott was doing a survey and a campaign about this, I said, well, that's nice. We'll kind of add it to the list of well-intended surveys and studies. But this one is a little bit different, not just because of the impact that the video has already had. It's a really good one, but also because of what they looked at and the physical aspect of what was studied in this survey. I want you to listen to a clip of the video. The whole thing is only a minute, and the rustling that you hear is slips of paper. Every time somebody makes a comment about diabetes, another slip of paper with that comment on it sticks to a man who has diabetes. And by the end, he is covered.
This post is giving me diabetes.
I thought diabetics couldn't eat donuts.
Do you even exercise daily and sit around?
Not making much progress.
JJ should this time. I should really watch what you eat.
Sit around on
You did it to yourself.
Under pressure.
By the end of this video, the man with diabetes is so weighed down by other people's comments that not only can you not see him, but he doesn't want to be seen. And the video is just part of the campaign here. I'm talking to Dr. Susan Guzman. She is the Director of Clinical Education and the co-founder of the Behavioral Diabetes Institute, a fantastic resource. They have clinical programs. They have online resources. Some of you may be familiar with Dr. Bill Polonsky. He's been a frequent guest of this podcast. I'm a big fan of his. In fact, Dr. Polonsky inspired the Bitch Fest webinar. He does a breakout session at conferences that is very similar. So, Dr. Polonsky, thank you for that. Dr. Guzman co-develop and co-facilitates a lot of BDI's continuing medical education for healthcare providers and lots of clinical programs. And her research specializes in overcoming barriers to management and promoting attitudes of living well with chronic illness. My conversation with Dr. Susan Guzman right after this. I love when I don't have to deal with a faraway mail order system, when I can just pick up diabetes supplies from the pharmacy. Omnipod is the only tubeless full-feature insulin pump available through the pharmacy. It makes it simple to pick up pods and insulin in the same place, and you avoid those high startup costs from traditional tubed insulin pumps. You simply pay as you pod. Remember, pharmacy means no commitment, and pharmacy means you can switch now, even if your tubed pump is under warranty. Learn more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Omnipod logo. For full safety risk information and free trial terms and conditions, visit omnipod.com/diabetesconnections. Dr. Susan Guzman, welcome to Diabetes Connections. Thanks for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here with you, Stacy.
You got it. Before we jump in and talk about this survey, I'd love to know a little bit more for people who are not familiar about what you do. Can you tell me a little bit about BDI?
Sure. I'm a diabetes psychologist, and I try to bring both awareness and help for the emotional barriers that come with living with diabetes. So at BDI, we have historically done group programs for people with diabetes and their families, and we do training programs for healthcare professionals so that they can do a better job addressing these issues, and we do research on these topics.
Let's jump in and talk about the survey, trying to elevate awareness of diabetes stigma. So high level, can you tell me a little bit about what you wanted to find out here?
Abbott was interested in learning the experience of people living with diabetes to see their experiences around diabetes stigma. And they surveyed almost 3,000 people living with either type 1 or type 2 diabetes. And it really highlighted how diabetes stigma is a pervasive, real, and yet often overlooked societal issue.
What did you find out? Again, kind of high level, and then we can delve into some more of the granular stuff.
Yeah, the survey revealed that nearly 70% of people with diabetes believe there's a stigma associated with it. And during the biometric phase, where they looked at a physiological stress response, stigmatizing statements around food almost always caused a significant response. For example, the question, should you really be eating that? Prompted the strongest biometric response, like elevated heart rate and increased perspiration, similar to that of a job interview. And we know that these serve as barriers like misconception and bias of people living with diabetes. They prevent people from getting the support and the care that they need to stay healthy.
Tell me a little bit more about how this survey was done, though, like measuring people's heart rate and sweating and things like that.
There was various measures of biometric data that was in a sub-study for people with type 1 diabetes. And yeah, isn't that interesting? Because, what we know is that when people feel shame, judgment, and blame, it's not just that they feel, embarrassment, that it actually causes a stress response.
I'm trying not to jump to too many conclusions before we get too far into this, but is part of the idea here to show that if you're getting a physical response like this, to convince people who may not believe that bias hurts people, like to show them that it's not just a comment that makes someone embarrassed, it's having a real physical effect?
Right. It's having a real physical effect, and it shows up in behavior. That we know that the shame and stigma surrounding people with diabetes serves as a barrier for people willing to seek needed care. And that's why the Abbott's Above the Bias initiative is so important. Misconceptions and stereotypes around diabetes contribute significantly to this reluctance. In the Abbott survey, 40% of people with diabetes have skipped a healthcare appointment due to stigma.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Because I don't understand that. And it might sound silly, but I don't understand how someone hearing, should you be eating that, makes them not want to go to the doctor.
Well, it's really more complicated than should you be eating that. How it often shows up in healthcare is feeling blamed and judged. You might relate to this too in your time living with as a parent with someone with diabetes. Is that sometimes insensitive comments come from well-intentioned healthcare professionals, and that it's the feeling of shame, blame, and judgment that actually can. It's not just an insensitive comment. There's a lot of ways that we blame and judge people with diabetes that makes them not want to seek care. It makes them want to avoid that terrible feeling.
It's funny that you say that because our endocrinologist was wonderful, but we sometimes saw other doctors when my son was growing up who really didn't understand, who maybe got one day, right, of training with type 1 diabetes. The eye doctor in particular always made it tough. And I'm remembering that feeling, and I'm a very outgoing person. I will correct people and I will educate when I think it's appropriate. But just that stress of, should I say something? Am I going to embarrass my child? It does make you not want to go back.
Exactly. And imagine someone who, isn't as experienced advocating or talking about diabetes. And there's some people that buy into these messages. They are to blame. And so it creates this feeling of why bother? And that's really what we're trying to work against.
I want to talk about the survey. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but you've been at this a long time. BDI has been around for more than 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to asking these questions, do you have any advice for people with diabetes? How do they manage this kind of stress?
Well, I've heard in my over 20 years at BDI, leading group programs for people with diabetes and their families, I have heard stories from people, all ages, types of diabetes, backgrounds, and 3 consistent themes emerge over and over and over again. And that is feeling misunderstood, feeling alone, and often feeling judged. And what we really want to do in the Abbott Above the Bias initiative is to not add more to do for people who live with diabetes, but to really help the rest of us do a better job.
Yeah, this should be an episode that people send to their friends and family, maybe.
Exactly. We know that living with diabetes is a big job that can take an emotional toll. And we know that people do better when they feel understood, cared about, and supported. And that's really what the Above the Bias initiative is about, to help build empathy and understanding for people who live with diabetes.
Did you find anything surprising in this study?
I was actually surprised that 40% of people had skipped a healthcare appointment due to stigma. Not so much that happens, because I hear from people that they do things like that. But when I hear a statistic like that, I know that to being willing to admit that in a survey means that probably a lot more of that happens. And in the physiological stress response, that was really unique to show that people actually feel not just embarrassed about these comments, not just hurt by these comments, but it actually causes stress.
Well, I wanted to ask a little bit more about that, because one of my questions when I saw this campaign was, that's nice. We've been talking about stigma for a long time. I mean, like, my son was diagnosed 18 years ago, and it wasn't that much longer after that when I started hearing about it. So I wanted to ask you what makes this one different. You really kind of answered that with the physical responses. Were there other elements in here that you think are different?
Well, I think that what's really amazing about this initiative is they really put a lot of effort around helping people build empathy. That very brief Above the Bias film is so powerful. And without using any words or statistics or anything, you can watch this film and get it as someone who doesn't have diabetes. You can look at this and go, wow, I had no idea it had that kind of impact. And Abbott is really making effort to help build awareness so that people with diabetes can feel more supported and get the care they need.
I thought that short film was amazing, and we'll link it up here if you haven't watched it yet. But I thought it was also interesting. It really didn't offer any solutions. In your experience, is bringing light to a problem like this, is awareness enough for some people to take a step, who may be perpetuating that stigma, to take a step back and think about their actions? Or is there something we should all be thinking about doing more to educate our friends and family? Right back to our conversation. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. Benny has been using the Dexcom CGM for more than 10 years now. The first insertion was in 2013, just before he turned 9. It was great then. I mean, if you had done finger sticks for a while, you know how amazing it is to go from that to continuous glucose monitoring. But it's even better now. The Dexcom CGM systems just keep improving. They continue to get more and more accurate with no finger sticks or scanning required. The easy push-button insertion has made it easy for Benny to do it himself. He has done every one since we switched to the G6 in 2018, which was great for his independence back then as a younger teen. And of course, we still love the alerts and alarms and that we can set them how we want. Find out more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. If your glucose alerts and readings from the G6 do not match symptoms or expectations, use a blood glucose meter to make diabetes treatment decisions.
We all need to be doing more. Awareness is just the beginning because awareness says, oh, there's a problem here. And that was the first step. We do want people to be taking away more, that there's a lot that can be done. And I urge everyone to recognize that these biases exist and to have empathy for people who live with diabetes. We know that we all can help dismantle diabetes stigma through self-awareness and finding ways to take action. So we always recommend start with yourself. We all have unconscious biases. So become aware of the common ways that judgment and blame can show up in how we talk about and with people with diabetes. Also, have the courage to call it out. If you see it or hear it, don't just ignore it. Be willing to speak up with your coworkers, with your family, with your friends, or on your social media. And I always recommend that people be curious. Learn the real facts about diabetes. If you have people in your life who live with diabetes, ask what you can do to be more supportive. And again, if you watch the Above the Bias film and go to abovebias.com, there is more information about this initiative and resources for what you can do about it. And I encourage everyone who has diabetes who may be listening to this to share it with their family and friends. It is a really effective way to start a conversation about it.
It's a great film. It's one of those things where it makes you kind of think about what you're doing. And as a mom of a kid with type 1 and the wife of a person with type 2, it's been a really interesting, let's call it an interesting journey to try to support and not judge, but at the same time to perhaps guide or nudge or help or, because there are things with diabetes that you need to do to stay healthy. And I know this isn't a conversation about like teaching your toddler about carb counting or the necessity of blood sugar checks, right? But at the same time, well-meaning family members, I find myself as Benny gets older, really having to bite my tongue and butt out.
Yeah.
So I don't want to sit here and present that this is easy.
No, it isn't easy. And when you're watching people in your life do things that you think might not be such a great decision, but at the end of the day, people with diabetes are unique and they're managing not just they're not just a disease, they're a person. Yeah. They're a person first. And they're juggling competing priorities and other challenges. And that's why I always recommend ask, and if you're noticing something, you say, I notice, that you're whatever, fill in the blank. Is there something I can do to be more supportive or to help you? Or is there anything I can do? Or would you like, is what I can do to not do anything at all? Be aware that, Stacey, as you mentioned, sometimes that's the real action step is to just be quiet and manage your own feelings, which sometimes is really hard.
I cannot tell you, and you probably have already guessed, and I know my listeners know being quiet, not one of my strong suits, but I will say that over the years, and it's because of advice like you would get from the BDI and other people who have helped me focus on mental health, it's because we've encouraged conversations with Benny from a very young age. Like, what would you like us to do? And then being able to say to him when he's 5, well, I'm sorry, but we're not ready to do that. But when he's 10, being able to say, yeah, you're ready for us to try that or something, just having those ongoing conversations. But when you talk about healthcare providers, I can't even imagine having an endocrinologist or, a lot of these folks just see a GP who makes you feel so judged and small. Obviously, change needs to come from that healthcare provider, but we're talking to an audience of people with diabetes. What can they do? Is there anything other than switch providers, which isn't an option for a lot of people?
Again, I'm reluctant to give people with diabetes one more job, but if they feel like it's really impeding their care and they don't want to go back, if you feel like you can advocate for yourself, I would tell them how the comments that they're making lead you to feel. That feels like judgmental to me, or that makes me feel embarrassed, or when I hear you say that, that makes me feel hopeless that I'm ever going to be able to reach treatment targets. Be willing to speak up. That isn't easy though. Just Stacey, as you said, that's you worry about like, am I going to embarrass my kid? And there's an authority in healthcare professionals that sometimes people feel like they don't have the right to speak up and tell their healthcare professional what they're doing impacts them.
Yeah. I think sometimes, not always, but sometimes our healthcare providers are rushed and they're not even aware of what they're doing. I have a doctor. This is probably a little too personal, but whatever. I have a doctor who I'm in the bathrobe they give you, right? The drape.
Yeah, the gown.
Or the gown. I have no clothes on. And he wants to talk to me about a serious issue. And I interrupted him and I said, I am not prepared to have this conversation with you. You need to leave. I need to get dressed and then we can talk like grown-ups. Like I need to sit in a chair for this one. And he left, he left and he came back and he said, that didn't ever occur to me. I wound up talking to some of my other female friends about this, and they say for those things like their doctor asks them to get dressed, they move to a different room. It's more of an office setting. But I was surprised that the doctor had never thought that through. So that silly story is just basically to illustrate that sometimes pointing these things out to your doctor, and hey, if you like what Susan said, write it down. Hit rewind on the podcast, write down what she said, bring it with you, read it, or send an email or whatever communication is good for you. I mean, I'm not the expert here, but that's definitely what I would advise as well, is kind of prepare. And your doctor may take it a lot better than you think because sometimes they are really overworked and they're not thinking.
Yeah, I've had people who I work with who had done exactly what you just said, Stacey. They wrote it down and actually they practiced it. And when they went in, they said, I wanted to talk to you about something that happened in our last visit and brought it up.
Good.
And actually, I've had healthcare professionals tell me that they've had patients that have told them that they were insensitive and that it really made a difference. Like they never forgot it. And it really made an impact not only for the person they were working with that had confronted them, but it actually changed how they practiced. So you could have a real difference by being willing to speak up. But I am also aware that that's hard.
Yeah, it's very hard. And like you said, who wants to give people with diabetes one more thing on their plate?
Yeah.
But if you're able to do that, I think it can really go far. I mean, many of us are not aware of how we come off sometimes. And I'm laughing because I've had conversations where like a friend or two has said later, like, wow, you were really strident about that. I was like, oh, I just thought we were having a good conversation. So sometimes we just don't know. Sometimes there's true ignorance,
Absolutely.
Well, this campaign is from Abbott. As we've mentioned now, you have worked on mental health and diabetes for a very long time. I'm kind of putting you in the corner here, but I don't know. I have mixed feelings about this one. Do you think things are getting better? I feel like we're talking about it more, but I'm not sure I feel like there's been enough of a shift to satisfy me.
I feel exactly the same way. But, I'm trying to look at progress from, for the 30,000 foot view. And just the fact that campaigns like this exist now, companies like Abbott are committing to initiatives like Above the Bias, that's progress. Just the fact that we are able to have more commitment to raising awareness, to build empathy and understanding for people with diabetes, I have to tell you, that feels like progress to me. And yet when I hear the negativity and how often people with diabetes are the punchline in a joke, or when people speak up about stigma and, the responses they get sometimes are downright hateful, I do get discouraged that we're not making nearly enough progress. And yet, I have to balance that with, raising awareness is how we start. And these initiatives, I really do think are going to really matter. One thing I always like to say, and I don't feel like we say it enough, is that people can live a long, healthy, and happy life with diabetes.
Yeah.
And anything we can do to help people get the care that they need and feel supported is worth the work.
Susan, I should have asked this at the beginning. Do you live with any kind of diabetes?
I don't have diabetes. I just love hundreds of people who do.
So to that end, we've mentioned BDI because I just love it so much. But why did you and Bill Polonsky start that? I mean, you're the co-founder of it. What was the idea?
The idea was, well, we both were specializing in diabetes. I was a new psychologist at the time. Bill Polanski was already an established diabetes psychologist. We both happened to live in San Diego. And when we met up, we had so many similar passions about trying to bring more help to people who live with diabetes and their families. Seeing the need and really believing that we could do something about it, we decided to start the Behavioral Diabetes Institute. And we're now in our 21st year, so we're proud of that.
Yeah. What is your hope between a survey like this, getting the word out, trying to educate more people, and with what you have learned in your experiences at BDI? What do you hope we see in terms of changes in perhaps the next 20 years?
I would love for us not to have to talk about the stigma surrounding diabetes, that people no longer feel blamed and judged. People feel more included and recognize that we make choices, that people know their own diabetes more than a stranger or even a family member. And so not to be insensitive in their comments or questions. I would love for people to just really feel more understood and less alone.
We talked about how stigma can have a physical effect, right? A detrimental effect. Does community, that's the first thing I always think of. Does community and fighting that stigma together, do we see a different effect there? Has anything been studied that way in terms of a positive change?
Well, we know that people that are more engaged in the diabetes community often feel less alone, and that itself can help people feel more understood. And almost always you'll hear someone else confront the stigma, like, you're not to blame, but there's another side to the diabetes community. There unfortunately is still way too much stigma that exists in the diabetes community, blaming people often with type 2 diabetes, like, well, they have the kind that they gave to themselves. And that contributes to stigma. And we know that nobody chooses diabetes, and that contributes to the stigma. So there's more work to be done in the diabetes community as well. Just awareness and understanding and really working to get rid of the blame and judgment that goes with diabetes.
Yeah, it is amazing to think about that. I was one of those people. I spent the first couple of years of my son's diagnosis trying to explain type 1 diabetes by throwing people with type 2 diabetes under the bus. I've written about that before. But looking back, it's not something I'm proud of, but I think it's important to talk about. I used to say that all the time, oh, he didn't cause this. It's not from eating too much sugar. It's not, what you think. And some of that is true, but I've learned so much from great people within the diabetes community. But here we are 20 years later, and I still hear that. So
Yeah.
that's really unfortunate. But
That one of the things that we learned from the Abbott survey is not just that words can be harmful, but also 70% of people said that when they hear a supportive comment, that it actually boosts their motivation to take action for their diabetes. And so that, again, that's more information that people do better when they feel encouraged and supported.
Susan, thank you so much for joining me. I would love to have you back. And we can't talk about mental health enough around diabetes. So I'd love to have you come back and talk a little bit more about that in the future. But I really appreciate it. And again, we'll link up everything that we talked about in the show notes in terms of the Abbott survey and the video if you haven't seen it. And Dr. Guzman, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'd be glad to come back.
As I said, I will link up much more to Abbott's campaign, Above the Bias. There is more to it than the video and the survey. We'll see what happens. I really appreciate these companies putting money and resources into this. But as Dr. Guzman says, it's really not fair to ask people with diabetes to do all of the work here. So that's why I said at the beginning, share this with friends and family who don't have diabetes. It's a pretty short interview. At least share the video with them from Abbott. Share it with your doctor. Reach out if you are having trouble having conversations with your doctor. BDI, Behavioral Diabetes Institute, has resources to help these conversations along. I'm not such a Pollyanna that I think something like this is going to make an immediate difference, but I do think that the more we talk about it and the more attention we bring to it, the better it will get. And Dr. Guzman touched on this briefly. People with type 2 face just as much bias as people with type 1. And I think many people with type 2, and I know that there's many of you who listen, and I really appreciate you being here, they just feel like no one cares. I hope this campaign reaches people who need to hear it. So thanks for spreading the word. Okay, we will have an In the News episode this week. Schedule got shifted around a little bit in the last couple of weeks due to travel and other things. I hope everybody is staying warm and spring is not too far away. Oh my goodness. I'm still thawing out from Cleveland. Thank you to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here soon. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.